Okay, so at the end of the last video, we reached these conclusions. If I have solid reasons for my beliefs, then evolutionary debunking arguments pose no threat. Otherwise, I commit the genetic fallacy. But if my beliefs are grounded in faith alone, then Doris's evidential-style evolutionary debunking argument seems to pose a significant threat. But someone might say, not so fast. You're overlooking a really important dimension of genealogical debunking arguments in that analysis. So remember Miriam Schoenfield's paper. It was, why do you believe what you do? Run some diagnostics on it. Now, if you recall her argument, I think it still seems to pose a problem for religious beliefs, whether they're merely faith-based, as we saw in the last video segment, or backed by solid reasons. Okay, so in other words, this also might be false. Even if you have solid reasons for your beliefs, a good evolutionary debunking argument might pose a threat to it. So what's the argument that she gave us? Well, she said, if we cannot set a belief aside when evaluating the truth of that belief, then we cannot recover that belief from the perspective of doubt. And so this is something that all of the authors have discussed almost in one way or another. And they have said, if you're evaluating a particular belief, you cannot rely on that belief when you're evaluating it, because that belief is the very thing that is at issue. So if you rely on that belief to evaluate that belief, you're begging the question. You're taking for granted the very thing that you're trying to sort of make a decision about. So that's premise one. And premise two says, we cannot set our heavily socially influenced moral, religious, and political beliefs aside when evaluating the arguments that support those beliefs. Therefore, we cannot recover our heavily socially influenced moral, religious, and political beliefs from the perspective of doubt. So premise one I already explained. You can't use the belief that's under discussion when you're trying to determine whether or not that belief is true. So if you want to evaluate the truth of a belief, you have to set that belief aside. So that's the idea behind Plantinga's reduction test. That's the idea behind so many of the arguments that we've been discussing. When can you make use of a belief, and when must you set it aside? Well, if it's been called into doubt and you're trying to determine whether or not it's true, you can't rely on it. That's kind of a general principle of philosophy. Premise two is also crucial here. So how does she justify that premise? Well, as you'll recall, she says, you can't set our heavily socially influenced moral, religious, and political beliefs aside when evaluating the arguments that support those beliefs, because those social influences inflect all our beliefs and intuitions. So you cannot set them aside because they shape your very mind. They shape the perspective that you rely on when you're evaluating any belief whatsoever. So the idea here is that our psychology is so pervasively inflected with the social influences that sort of shaped the way we came to think and understand things. We just can't set those things aside when we evaluate our beliefs. Trying to do so would be like trying to set your mind aside when you evaluated something. It's just impossible. What would that even mean? So someone like Schoenfield might say, look, these evolutionary debunking argument nerds can run a similar kind of argument. They could say, if we cannot set a belief aside when evaluating the truth of that belief, then we cannot recover that belief from the perspective of doubt. So that's the same first premise. And then they can say, we cannot set aside our evaluative beliefs that have been shaped by evolutionary processes when evaluating the arguments that support those beliefs. Therefore, we cannot recover our evaluative beliefs that have been shaped by evolutionary processes. And the justification for premise two, again, it's very similar to the other one. Why can't we set them aside? Because evolution has shaped all our evaluative beliefs. We cannot set them aside because we cannot set aside our own mind. So Plantinga's reduction test can't redeem our religious and moral beliefs because it's ultimately impossible to subtract those beliefs from our evidence base. And so we also cannot just point to the rational grounds that we have for our religious beliefs or our moral beliefs and consider our job done, because our satisfaction with those arguments will depend deeply on deeply socially and evolutionarily influenced beliefs. So there's a kind of inescapability baked into this argument that Schoenfield is making. Essentially, once our evaluative judgments, whether they're moral or religious, are called into question with this kind of evolutionary debunking argument, we can't recover them because we can't do any thinking independently of those evaluative judgments. So once they come into doubt, we can't recover them. So genealogical debunking arguments and evolutionary debunking arguments work, right? Again, some authors are going to say not so fast, but we'll take a break before we consider what those arguments are.